I am James Bradley, and this is Untold Pacific, a podcast series which mines 40 years of my life in Asia and my 4 best-selling books to create historical travelogues about the American experience on the other side of the Pacific. My book, Flags of Our Fathers, was published in May of 2000. It was an immediate hit. The New York Times declared it the surprise runaway bestseller of the season. Within days, Steven Spielberg called to get the movie rights. Later, Clint Eastwood would produce the movie Flags of Our Fathers. The book takes you far out into the Pacific in World War II to the bloody sands of Iwo Jima. The Battle of Iwo Jima still stands today as the worst battle in the history of the United States Marine Corps. It is also America's most heroic moment. We stamped out more medals for bravery for Iwo Jima than any other event in the history of the United States. The book follows 22 American boys who, on February 23, 1945, climbed an extinct volcano named Mount Suribachi. My father was one of those boys. Atop Mount Suribachi, they raised 2 flags. My father helped. After World War II, my dad was silent about Iwo Jima. He died in 1994, taking his secrets to the grave. 4 years after my dad's passing, I ventured across the Pacific to Iwo Jima. I climbed the rugged slopes of Mount Suribachi. From the top, I beheld the panorama of volcanic rock set in a deep blue sea. Later, I stood where a Japanese grenade had exploded, sending shrapnel into my dad's legs. Down at my feet were copper-colored stones. I bent and picked up a handful. But they weren't stones. They were shards of weathered and rusted shrapnel. Back in 1945, for over 1 month, Japanese soldiers and American Marines, 100,000 of them, had hurled metal at each other. Now, 2 generations later, pieces of shrapnel form a sort of carpet over the island of Iwo Jima. When we buried my father 49 years after the battle, he still had that Japanese shrapnel in his legs. Millions have read the book. More millions have seen the movie Flags of Our Fathers. Both have been translated into many languages around the world. Now I meet people who say, "Boy, I can sure see why that was a bestseller." I think to myself, I wish I had heard those words back in the 1990s when I was trying to get the book off the ground. They all said to me, "A book? You're going to write a book?" No way. Here's the story. After my father died, I telephoned my mother and I asked her, "What did Dad tell you about Iwo Jima?" She said, "Well, he only talked about it once, on our first date, for 7 or 8 disinterested minutes, and never again in a 47-year marriage did he say the words Iwo Jima." Growing up with my dad, we didn't think he was a hero. That's not how you look at your father when you're young. I was more interested in football and cheerleaders. There's a scene in the movie Flags of Our Fathers that depicts me as a 12-year-old boy. I'm seated at the Bradley lunch table. There's 8 kids and 2 parents, total of 10. The phone rings, and I get up to answer the phone. It's a phone call from Walter Cronkite's producers in New York. CBS is calling for an interview. I knew what to say. I had been trained. "Oh, I'm sorry, sir. My father's not here. He's up in Canada fishing in his ice shack." No, I'm sorry. He doesn't have a telephone." "Oh, sir, I'm sorry. We don't know when he'll come home. He just stays up there and fishes." After my dad's funeral, my brother Mark was searching for my dad's will in my dad's office space. We were surprised when Mark found 3 cardboard boxes stuffed in a closet. At the bottom of one box was a letter that my father had written home from Iwo Jima 2 days after the flag raisings. It was a letter to his mother and father in Appleton, Wisconsin. He was 22 years old. In that letter, he wrote about how he had not eaten or slept for 3 days. He also wrote, "I had a little to do with raising the American flag on Mount Suribachi, and it was the happiest moment of my life." I cried when I read that letter, wondering why my dad had been unable to share that happy moment with me, a son. I wanted to know more, so I did the only thing I could do. I picked up the telephone and I called all the veterans who were alive who had been with my father atop Mount Suribachi. They told me about an enormous battle and who did what. They told me about a moment where a Marine had fallen wounded from a Japanese machine gun. My father was a Navy corpsman. The Army calls them medics. They're medical officers. My dad ran through what was described as merciless Japanese gunfire to get to the wounded Marine's side. He stabilized him, and then he dragged that Marine back to safety with bullets pinging off the rocks at his feet. Marines who saw this cried, and my dad was recommended for the Navy Cross, which he was later awarded. The Navy Cross is the nation's #2 award for valor, right under the Medal of Honor. After my dad passed, an Iwo Jima Marine telephoned my mother and asked her if my dad had ever talked to her about his Navy Cross. My mother said, "What's a Navy Cross?" I learned about so many heroes of Iwo Jima. Jack Lucas was 15 years old when he hit the sands of Iwo Jima. He wasn't supposed to be there. He was a stowaway. 15 years old. He didn't have a rifle. He picked up a rifle of a dead Marine and started fighting. Then a Japanese grenade rolled towards him. He jumped on it. Another grenade came. He put it under his stomach with the first one. They both went off. Years later, when I interviewed Jack Lucas, he had endured 37 reconstructive surgeries. I asked Mr. Lucas, "Why did you jump on those grenades?" He answered, "To save my buddies." Franklin Sousley was a fun-loving hillbilly from Hilltop, Kentucky. One day his mother Goldie was crying. Franklin was about to go off to boot camp, United States Marine Corps. Franklin was holding Goldie in his big arms, and then he stepped back, he put his hands on her shoulders, and he looked in her eyes and said, "Mama, don't you worry about me, 'cause when I come back, I'll be a hero." 2 days before the end of the Battle of Iwo Jima, Franklin Sousley got 1 bullet in the back and was buried at the age of 19 on Iwo Jima, along with 6,824 American boys and 22,000 Japanese boys. The telegram to tell Goldie that she would never see her oldest boy again came to the Hilltop General Store. Goldie's farm miles away did not have a telephone, so a barefoot boy ran that telegram through the Kentucky hills up to Goldie's farm. The story comes from the neighbors that they could hear Goldie scream all night and into the morning. I went down to Hilltop and did a little research, and that's when I realized the neighbors lived a quarter of a mile away. Ira Hayes was a dignified Pima Indian from Arizona. Ira saw too many of his buddies die on Iwo Jima. He returned with post-traumatic stress syndrome, a concept that we couldn't even pronounce back then. 3 months before Ira died, he gave an interview to Time magazine. In that interview, Ira said, "I feel like I'm about to crack up. thinking about my buddies, those guys who didn't come back, those guys who were better than me. Ira Hayes died at the age of 33, face down, dead drunk. After Ira died, Johnny Cash had a hit song called The Ballad of Ira Hayes, and this is how the chorus went. Calling drunken Ira Hayes, he doesn't come here anymore. Not that whiskey-drinking Indian, nor the Marine who went to war. I was 40 years old when my dad died. I wasn't an author. I had never written an article in anything. I didn't write for the school newspapers. I had never been published in a magazine. Write a book? Me? It was the farthest thing from my mind. I didn't imagine writing a book. My first idea was to have Flags of Our Fathers produced as a movie. But how was I going to produce a Hollywood movie? I did a little research, and then I realized there was a rich man in Dallas, Texas. He had produced a patriotic movie, and in his office was a bronze replica of the Iwo Jima flag raising. I cold called him on the phone one day. He answered, "Hello, this is Ross Perot." I said, "Mr. Perot, my dad was on Mount Suribachi. They raised 2 flags. I've interviewed all the veterans of that moment. I've got the stories that have never been told. We can produce a movie. You know Hollywood. Let's go." There was a pause, and Ross Perot said, "No, Bradley, Hollywood will steal from you. You've got to write a book, and it's got to be heavy enough you drop it on your foot and it hurts." Well, this isn't what I wanted to hear. I said, "Mr. Perot, look, the Iwo Jima flag raising photo, that's really film on paper if you think about it. And they've made 3 films on Iwo Jima. But we have the facts. We've got the stories. We can do it. Let's make a movie." There'd be a pause. He'd hear me out, never interrupt. And then he'd say, "No, Bradley, Hollywood will steal from you. You got to write a book, and it's got to be heavy enough you drop it on your foot and it hurts." Mr. Perot was such a patient man. I called him 7 times over a period of 2 weeks trying to pitch him on my movie idea. He'd always listen, always hear me out, and then he'd say, "Bradley." It was the same thing every time. Finally, in the last call, I said, "I know, Mr. Perot. I'll write a book. It's got to be heavy. Drop it on my foot. I got it. Thank you." You know, later, when Flags of Our Fathers came out, I sent the first copy to my mother, the second copy to Ross Perot. But back to the story. I'm 40 years old and write a book? Me? I didn't want to think about writing a book. That was not in my mind's computer. I went across the street to a local Barnes & Noble, and I bought 3 books on how to write a book. As I'm reading these, I'm imagining the cover of Flags of Our Fathers, and I realize Heroes of Iwo Jima are going to be on the cover. And I think to myself, I've got to write a good book. Well, what's a good book at the level of the Heroes of Iwo Jima? That's got to be a New York Times #1 bestseller. Oh my God. I'm finished before I start. This is an impossible task. But in my research on the Battle of Iwo Jima, I learned that many back then thought it would be impossible for the Marines to take Iwo Jima. The invasion of Iwo Jima was an amphibious assault. Amphibious assaults are the single most difficult military operation to do, bar none. You're going from sea to land. You're going from sea to land with people shooting at you. In World War I, something happened to convince the military geniuses that amphibious assaults were now impossible. A young Winston Churchill was running the British Navy. He ordered an amphibious assault against Gallipoli in Turkey. Modern machine guns raked the Brits at the shoreline. It was a dismal failure. Winston Churchill lost his career, many thought for good, and the military geniuses concluded that amphibious assaults were no longer possible. If I took you to the West Point of the early 1920s, we could go from classroom to classroom and you wouldn't find any teachers talking about amphibious assaults. Young George Patton and Dwight D. Eisenhower at West Point, they never got their feet wet jumping out of amphibious assault crafts. Why would you do that? Everybody knows it's impossible. It wasn't until 1925 that a young Marine captain named Howland Mad Smith got his best and brightest together. He explained to them that the next mission of the United States Marine Corps would be taking back Japanese islands in the Pacific. To do that, he said, the Marine Corps is going to redevelop the art of amphibious assault. Well, you couldn't blame everyone in the audience if they wanted to run for the doors. Nobody wanted to be part of a loser's team. And it was at that moment where Howland Mad Smith said, "You listen to me. We're going to do the impossible, and we're going to do the impossible well." It's from that moment that World War II in the Pacific was won. Howland Mad Smith and his guys, trial and error, 20 years, they perfected amphibious assault. But there were geniuses who didn't believe. I found a 1943 article in the New York Times by their military expert explaining that the Marines are wrong. They won't be able to take back heavily fortified islands from the Japanese, that amphibious assaults are just not possible. But Howland Mad Smith did it on that long road to Tokyo. He put the Marines on Iwo Jima, and they won the battle. He proved that they could do the impossible and do the impossible well. So many years later, when my big challenge came, I thought I would emulate Howland Mad Smith, try to convince a small group of folks that maybe the impossible was possible. I have to admit I was scared. I closed my office door and practiced my pitch in front of the mirror. "Hi, I'm James Bradley. My dad was one of the guys up Mount Suribachi when they raised 2 flags. I've interviewed all the veterans of that moment. I have the stories that have never been told. I'm going to write a book, and I think it can be a New York Times." Oh, man, I could hardly get it out. New York Times #1. Me, I never wrote a book. But I practiced it for 3 days, and at the end of that time, I thought to myself, you're going to have to tell this pitch to somebody outside this office. So I'm a brave guy. I telephoned my mommy out in northern Wisconsin, and I said, "Mom, I've got the stories that have never been told. I'm going to write a book. It can be a New York Times #1 bestseller." My mother paused and then said to me, "Yes, maybe some people around the hometown will buy it." To get a book published, you need an agent. I cold called almost 20 agents. They wouldn't listen to me. They didn't want a follow-up call. Some of them just hung up. Finally, an agent felt sorry for me. He met with me, heard me out, and he said, "James, I'll take you on under one condition." I said, "What's that?" He said, "You shut up about this being a New York Times #1 bestseller. That's insulting to the publishers. You've never written a thing." And I said, No, it's not about me. It's about the heroes of Iwo Jima. So at first we sent out 3 proposals to 3 publishers. And I'm thinking, 3 publishers? 3 proposals? I wonder who I'll choose. Back in the 1990s, there was something called letters. The first letter back from the first publisher came. I opened it. It was a no. I couldn't believe it. I wasn't disappointed. I was shocked. I felt sorry for the publisher. Who can turn down flags of our fathers? The second letter came. That was a no too. But the third one came, and that was a no. The 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, all no's. The 9th no, the publisher helpfully wrote to me, "James, we understand you're being turned down around town with this Flags of Our Fathers. We want to tell you it's because the stories you're presenting are not worth the paper we'd print them on. 10, 11, 12, 13, all no's. The 14th no, the publisher wrote a little more to me and said, James, you have to understand that no one is interested in what crying old veterans are telling you. This was taking months. Months turned into years. My family was doubting me. A friend from Chicago flew into New York where I was living to do an intervention. He took me to lunch. James, he said, 18 publishers have told you the same thing. Don't you think the publishers know more about their business than you do? In the end, 27 publishers wrote me letters explaining that Flags of Our Fathers would be a dud. It took 26 months, that's 2 years and 2 months, I was counting, to find a publisher. Many interviewers have since asked me, what's the bottom line message for you in Flags of Our Fathers? For me, it's simple. Flags of Our Fathers is a story of everyday, ordinary American boys who did the impossible. And they did the impossible well. But the Iwo Jima Marines will never tell you that. They are humble heroes. While researching the book, I went to many Iwo Jima reunions. One day in Texas, I was seated in a hotel lobby with Jesse Boatwright, an Iwo Jima veteran and friend of my father's. Jesse sat in his chair with a toothpick in his teeth and thought for a few moments. Then he looked over at me and he said, "You know, Bradley, you think we did something special out there in the Pacific, but we were just ordinary guys doing our duty." Flags of Our Fathers is about those ordinary guys, those heroes of Iwo Jima. My father never talked to me about the Battle of Iwo Jima, but I think he told me his bottom line when I was 13 years old, but I was too young to understand it at the time. That day, my teacher had called my father a hero in front of the class. She asked that he come and speak to us. That night when my dad came home, I was so excited I rushed him at the door. Dad, my teacher says you're a hero and she wants you to speak to my class." My dad came in the door and then he said gently to me, "Gee, I'm sorry I can't talk to your class because I forgot everything." Well, I was pretty disappointed. When I looked up at him, our eyes met. And then he looked at me as if he wanted to embed an idea in my brain for the rest of my life. And he said, "James, I want you to always remember the heroes of Iwo Jima are the guys who didn't come back."